Welcome to POTUS 2016, where we keep watch on the Oval Office and pour cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. And speaking of cold, I have one, so please forgive my gravelly voice today. Now, today, women's rights in the age of Trump. And in our evidence-based politics segment, deportation, where's it been and where's it going? 2016 did not turn out to be the year of the woman. Hillary Clinton will not be the first woman president, and the man who was elected has boasted of grabbing women and threatened to sue his accusers. Donald Trump has also vowed to appoint Supreme Court justices who will eliminate a woman's right to choose abortion, and the president-elect has already chosen a Health and Human Services Secretary, Georgia Representative Tom Price, who favors stripping Planned Parenthood of federal funds. Price has a 242-page plan to repeal and partially replace Obamacare legislation, which currently includes contraception coverage and maternity care, both of which are absent from his plan. And Trump's choice for Attorney General, Senator Jefferson Sessions of Alabama, could mean weaker enforcement of equal rights laws. Our guests plan to take arms against this sea of troubles. Joining us, Andrea Miller, president of the National Institute for Reproductive Health Action Fund, Zerlina Maxwell, political analyst who directed progressive media for the Hillary Clinton campaign and has written for Feministing.com and Ebony, and Gillian Thomas, staff attorney at the ACLU's Women's Rights Project. She is author of Because of Sex, One Law, 10 Cases, and 50 Years that changed American women's lives at work. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
And
good to be here.
Considering my voice, you're going to do most of the talking. And Gillian, let me start with you on this point. When we talk about what's at stake for women post this election, it is not just reproductive rights, even though that's vitally important, but that's the one that gets talked about all the time. It's more than that, right?
Absolutely. It's the one that gets talked about the most because that's the one he's talking about the most. So when we think about what we have coming down the pike to be fighting, at this point it's really not clear. He hasn't laid out any specific policy proposals that we can begin to do battle against or, heaven forfend, actually do some positive work with.
So what else is in danger? Employment rights, for example?
Absolutely. There was a lot of progress made under President Obama across all agencies of the federal government in terms of enforcement of civil rights in education, in employment, with respect to the rights of survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault through the Department of Justice. So it was really an aggressive strategy of both enforcement of existing laws and expanding definitions of those laws, most notably, I think, in the area of LGBT rights in all areas, education, employment, housing. So that's of particular concern.
So, Zerlina, want to pick it up?
Well, I think that, you know, we're talking about sort of the fundamentals when it comes to women's rights. So the reason why reproductive rights becomes, you know, the focus is because if you don't have control over your reproduction, you really don't have control over when you want to go to college, what you want to do with your career, and when you want to have a family. And so, like she said, yes, there are other aspects to this, you know. Advocates on campuses have been working very, very hard to hold colleges accountable to the standards set forth in Title IX. And so a lot of those things are at risk under a president who, as you said in the introduction, really doesn't have a good record on women, has talked about them in demeaning terms. And so how can we expect him to uphold laws that we've worked so hard over the past 8 years to protect?
Andrea?
Yeah. I mean, look, the reality is that Donald Trump has put together on the campaign trail everything he said. His view of women across the board is absolutely articulated in how he's addressed reproductive health and rights. His claim, oh yeah, there'll have to be some punishment for women if abortion's outlawed. And yes, I'm going to appoint justices to overturn Roe versus Wade. And in fact, maybe I'll think about it again. And so if it's banned in a lot of states, women will just go to other states. But most women don't actually have a private plane to be hopping through the states like Trump does. So to just the sort of nonchalance, the lack of understanding, and that is alongside all of that demeaning rhetoric, really speaks volumes. And when you look at those he's surrounded himself with, I mean, his running mate was a clear signaling effect.
Right.
His running mate, Mike Pence, both in the Congress and then as governor of Indiana, has taken the playbook of the most extreme wing of those opposed to women's fundamental rights and ability to make these really critical decisions. And he has put them into practice. We even saw a woman in Indiana serve jail time for allegedly trying to terminate her own pregnancy. That is the level of extremity that we're talking about here.
How long ago was that?
Very recently, actually, Purvi Patel was sentenced to 20 years, and Mike Pence did nothing about it, sat idly by as that happened. Thankfully, there was a concerted effort in the courts, and after her spending 3 years in jail, that was reversed very recently, within the last few months, actually. Right. The idea of putting women in jail for having abortions, for making decisions about their lives and their bodies and their futures and their families, is not at all far-fetched under this administration.
By the same token, some of the other things that you raised are things that Trump is trying to stake out progressive positions on. He made sure that with Ivanka Trump, they announced that they are going to have a maternity leave policy. He says he's strong on LGBT and doesn't want the Supreme Court to overturn same-sex marriage rights. So he's not 100% against some of the things that you were mentioning before.
It's hard to know because he changes positions so often, and at the same time that he's out on the campaign trail talking about this maternity leave, not paternal or family leave policy, which is one of the reasons we were troubled by it.
Talk about that for a minute. What's the difference between that and, say, the Clinton plan?
Sure. Well, it was only 6 weeks, for one thing, whereas the Clinton plan was 12. Secondly, it only applied to birth mothers. And so that leaves out not just fathers, but adoptive parents, gay and lesbian parents who are possibly non-biological. And it is a long-standing kind of dichotomy, regressive way of looking at the family and who bears responsibility for bearing children and raising families that only will, as experts have told us, continue to isolate and ghettoize women in the workplace as being the expensive ones, the ones who take time off. And rather than expanding that right to all family members, not just for childbearing and childrearing, but for family care. I mean, the idea that childbirth is an inconvenience, as Trump famously said when he was still an employer at Trump Enterprises, is very much reflected and is going to be perpetuated by a program that only affects mothers. One other thing, it was married women only. So there's also a nice shaming scarlet letter in there.
Married women would be eligible for the maternity leave benefit?
Well, again, he hasn't put anything forward since he's been in office. But while he was on the campaign, so we will wait and see what that looks like. But while he was on the campaign trail, yes, it was just married women.
And you've written about sexual assault. We know what Trump said in that tape on the Access Hollywood bus. Are there policy implications of that? Obviously, he's not going to propose some kind of a bill that legitimizes sexual assault by celebrities or anybody else. But are there implications to that, or does it just go down as a horrifying thing that he said?
No, I think that there are definitely important implications, because when you have somebody in a position of leadership like the President of the United States, who is admittedly participating in conduct that by definition is sexual assault, that means that you don't necessarily have even that role model as the president, who understands the issue fundamentally. And I think that people who are accused of sexual assault will now point to Trump as an example of, well, I just did what the president did. I mean, can you imagine that being a defense in court? But I also think that, you know, just to be optimistic for a second, I do think that we've made a significant amount of progress in that when people heard the Access Hollywood tape, they immediately knew that he was describing sexual assault. And the question that Anderson Cooper posed to him at the debate was framed around consent, which I think is significant progress in understanding what sexual assault actually is. So that's a good thing. It's just really unfortunate that the president has been on the record admitting to that conduct.
Andrea,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but one last thing. Jeff Sessions, his nominee for AG, didn't think it was sexual assault, which is even more telling.
Right.
What kind of enforcement are we going to be getting from DOJ in terms of police departments not responding to sexual assault or treatment of survivors that is somehow discriminatory? Right. So it is a horrible role model situation, but there even is potential for it to be translated into policy. So.
On Roe.
Yeah.
We're fairly far away from it being potentially overturned, aren't we? Because the Texas case this year was just upheld with Texas having gone too far in the eyes of the court based on violation of Roe, which presumes Roe, right?
It does. So you can look at this one of two ways. You can look at it as a numbers game and what does the court look like, which we need to do. And in fact, we know that he will take every opportunity to try to add to those numbers going the opposite direction.
If enough justices
with
retire,
enough, right, if they retire, the first justice pick that he does won't change the numbers. However, more importantly, when you think about the signaling effect, right, the message that is being sent to the states, to state legislatures, which are also overwhelmingly dominated by Republicans who unfortunately today are aligned with the anti-choice movement. And you've already seen more than 300 laws passed against abortion just since 2010. Now they're going to ratchet it up. It isn't just going to be volume. Right. They are not going to take the Texas decision and say, okie dokie, we're going to fold up our tent and go home now. They're going to say, no, let's go with the heart at Roe. Let's start passing outright bans for all reasons. Let's start passing laws that aim at the heart of the ability of women to make these decisions, because we want to flood the states and the courts with those kinds of laws. And what we're hearing already from clinics all across this country is that the violence and the harassment that they already face has escalated. They now have people in their faces with their signs saying, we won, you lost, and you're going to be shut down. Saying to women, you're not going to be able to do this after this week. There's a level of animosity that it could unleash that is particularly pernicious.
I know the states have been the places where some of these restrictive laws,
where most of them come.
Yes, but my next question is, could this now come from Congress with a friendly president who wouldn't veto such laws? And what kinds of laws might they be, to be specific?
Unfortunately, here we also have a very clear roadmap, particularly because Congress has been trying it. They've been road testing this. Thankfully, we've had a president who's held the line, and we've been able to hold the line in the Senate on a lot of things. But certainly they're talking about defunding Planned Parenthood. And when you look at, again, the HHS Secretary nominee, he's led that charge. So that is one that looks like, where is the blockage for that? How do we stop that? That's going to be a huge, we probably think, first 100-day thing. We know that they want to codify the Hyde Amendment, which has been an annual appropriations rider across many aspects of the government.
No Medicaid funding for abortions.
Well, it goes
poor
much
women.
more, right. The Hyde Amendment specifically is for low-income women, women who rely on public programs for their health care, but it is rife throughout the entire federal system. It covers federal employees. It affects women who get their health care from Indian Health Services. It affects women in the Peace Corps. It affects women who are in the military. Yeah. So it has these tentacles. Now, it has to happen every year now. They want to put it into statute, so it makes it even harder to remove it.
You were with the Clinton campaign, which had proposed doing away with the Hyde Amendment, so Medicaid could be used to fund abortions for low-income women. Was that ever a realistic goal with a presumably Republican Congress?
Well, I think that it was important as a signaling mechanism because the reproductive justice movement had been working and trying to make repealing Hyde a part of sort of the mainstream advocacy position, and the Democratic Party actually accepted that as part of the official platform at the convention this summer. So I think the left is sort of moving in this direction because it's low-income women, but it's disproportionately Black and Latina women. And so if they don't have actual access in real life to, the full slate of reproductive health care, not just abortion, but the full slate, because if you close Planned Parenthood, they don't have access to contraception or cancer screenings, annual exams. I mean, there's the basics that people are limited to being able to access. And if you don't have access to birth control, how are you supposed to be able to plan out your life? And so because it was disproportionately impacting low-income women who are Black and Latina, I think it was important because the Democratic base is made up of Black and Latina.
Please.
I was going to say, it was a really important step, a really remarkable step for the Democratic Party in the platform this time. In addition to having candidates running on it, to embed that in the platform, to say that we recognize that the decisions around reproduction and the ability to make these choices in our lives cannot be only the purview of those who have means.
Right.
And that was a really important move forward, and I think you're absolutely right. We've all been working very hard to get that into the mainstream of this movement. And again, a positive note, that's not going to go away. We were having conversations about what happened when the Hyde Amendment first went through, and it felt like people kind of just let it happen. I mean, some people were fighting, but not to the extent that you would want to see. I don't think we'll see that this time around. I think an attempt to codify the Hyde Amendment will be met with its extraordinary outpouring of concern and activism.
And you talked about the disparate impact on Black and Latina women.
Right.
Does that remind us that this election turned out to be much more about race than it was about gender, even with the first woman president potentially on the ballot? Because we see 53% of white women, despite all these issues, voted for Donald Trump.
Well, I think that's where you need sort of an intersectional analysis. So it's not race or gender, it's really both. And so I think that there was a feeling of, resentment and not liking the first Black president, right? So you had a lot of people who were very upset for the past 8 years. And then you also had people who were very uncomfortable with the idea of a woman being the commander-in-chief. And so you sort of had the perfect storm of gender and race conflating into, I think, which is an unfair lens through which to view Hillary Clinton, because she's an individual person. And I think that there was a lot of feelings and I think unsettled emotions that Americans were feeling that were projected onto Hillary. But I think that it's both. It's race and gender.
And you have a survey.
Yes, we have really interesting evidence that shows in the issue of abortion, for example, people are not only saying that it should be safe and legal, which has been the mantra for a very long time, but they want very clearly for the experience to be supportive of women, for it to be affordable, for it to be accessible in their communities, for it not to be embarrassing, for them not to feel shame. I mean, it really is a very supportive community out there, and I think it's important to remember this election did not change that.
Right.
That is, in fact, where the American public have been and are. There's a recent Quinnipiac poll that once again reinforced what we've seen consistently, that 2/3 of Americans at least support Roe versus Wade, believe that this is an important right, believe that these decisions need to be in women's hands. And again, we may not have people in the White House in the future, in the near term, who believe in that, but it does not change where the public is, and I think that they will be hopefully pleasantly surprised by what kind of response they're going to get when they start to try to tear this down.
We're almost out of time for this segment. There's going to be a big march in Washington, I know, on the day after the inauguration. That's Saturday, the 21st of January. Am I right that that has a women's issues theme primarily? Do you know?
That's my understanding, yeah, and that it came out of this real outpouring of anger and frustration that this person who was so obviously antithetical in every way, both in personal and professional stance to women's concerns, could actually have won and have taken so many women with him.
Yeah.
And I think that there's been a real surge emotionally. I think social media has been a great locus for this, of helping focus that anger. One other thing I just wanted to mention, picking up on Andrea's point about polling, paid family leave is an issue that enormously popular. I think it's 3/4 of Americans, and yet we're the only developed country that doesn't have it. So again, to try to inject a positive note here, I think we're going to be seeing a lot of activity on the state level, as we did, for instance, in New York just in the last term around this issue as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Zerlina, you're going to stay with us as we bring on some additional evidence. Time for evidence-based politics, where we pour cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. 18 months ago, then candidate Donald Trump famously warned that criminals were flooding over the southern border and he would build a great wall to stop them and others. He later said he would create some kind of deportation force to track down the estimated 11 million undocumented people already here. It was overheated campaign rhetoric. In his first post-election TV interview with 60 Minutes, Trump scaled down his plan.
What we are going to do is get the people that are criminal and have criminal records, gang members, drug dealers. We have a lot of these people, probably 2 million, it could even be 3 million. We're getting them out of our country or we're going to incarcerate. But we're getting them out of our country. They're here illegally.
Assuming President-elect Trump wants to deport people legally, what's the procedure? What's the history of deportation from our shores? And what's really new? Hasn't the Obama administration been deporting undocumented criminals in large numbers for years? Our guest is Anna Law, professor of political science and constitutional rights at Brooklyn College. She's the author of The Immigration Battle in American Courts. And Zerlina Maxwell stays with us. Professor Law, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
So how different is Donald Trump's proposal on deportation, now that he's rolled it back to the degree that he has, from what President Obama has been doing?
President Obama deported about between 2 and 3 million people. And Trump has said that in his most recent 60-minute interview that he intends to deport 2 to 3 million criminals. Now, the question, he's prioritizing criminals, which is what Obama did as well. But Obama started doing that in 2015, only when he got a lot of resistance from the advocacy community. So how different is...
He started doing it, he was doing it before 2015, wasn't he?
He made it more clear. He had augmented this program called Secured Communities, which is a corroboration between local law enforcement and the federal immigration officials. And that was, the critics were saying, that's scooping up a lot of people that were not hardcore, worst of the worst, violent criminals. They were people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time.
And Trump?
Trump says that he is going to focus on violent criminals. And but the problem is that these think tanks are saying we don't have that many. We have about 800,000 criminals with removable, deportable offenses. So if he's going to actually meet that target, 2 to 3 million people to deport, he would be including lawful permanent residents. These are people with green cards as well to make that number.
So not just the undocumented.
Correct.
And what about their children? He has said that he would undo President Obama's executive action known as DACA, which allows those children, those young adults who were brought here as children, but illegally, who've been given the right to stay. He'd undo that. But we don't know if he'll really undo that, right?
Well, he has said that he would undo it, and he said he would repeal what he called Obama's illegal amnesty. But we have had no information, which is causing a lot of widespread concern about how you undo it. He could undo it one way by simply letting people's registration and work authorization expire, because they
have to be renewed periodically.
Right. So he could just simply let those documents expire, in which case the person reverts to the status they were before, the undocumented status, without any protection from deportation. Or he could actively go find people and remove them immediately.
Zerlina, you have a follow-up?
In terms of sort of the role of private prisons in the process, do you think that there's a danger that they're going to expand and build more private prisons in order to house the millions more undocumented people that they are going to, quote, deport? Because we know that, that's a process, and in the meantime, they're put into these private facilities.
The role of private prisons is very concerning, because the stock in two of the biggest private prison companies rose after the election's results were known, and those private prisons have also lobbied for a Trump presidency. So the reason why we use private prisons in detaining immigrants is the federal government simply does not have enough space to hold everyone that they want to hold.
And in fact, the Obama administration is presently in court at the Supreme Court arguing for the right of the government to continue to indefinitely hold, and without due process, without a hearing on why they're being held, immigrants who are believed to be here illegally.
The case is pending, and the problem with that is because Obama did put so many people in deportation proceedings. The problem is the immigration bureaucracy is overloaded. And so there's a 1,000-day nationwide average wait to get before an immigration judge to even argue or say anything to an official, including claiming asylum, that could grant you a green card in this country. And then there's a couple-year wait if you appeal beyond the immigration judge to the Board of Immigration Appeals, and then multiple years of waits if you appeal through the federal courts.
Given that, how much could President Trump actually put into the system if he wants a big new wave of deportation cases?
Well, you could argue the infrastructure is already there. It is severely taxed, but the machinery is already there. Now, he has told his supporters that he would remove people on day one. They're out of the country. You simply can't do that. That every undocumented person, if they are picked up by immigration officials, if they do not waive their rights to a hearing, you have to give them the hearing. And right now there's a 1,000-day nationwide wait to appear before an immigration judge.
So that's the law. Give us some political analysis on this.
Well,
is there any political impediment to Trump doing what he wants to do here?
I think so, because I think that we're moving in a direction where we're trying to frame the issue of immigration around families and keeping families together and not putting walls between families. And one of his big tenets on the campaign trail was building a wall that Mexico was going to pay for. We don't know if that's going to happen, but I think that throughout the campaign, framing the issue as keeping families together, right? Because in many instances, people are deported, and then the crime for which they're alleging against them is that they've re-entered the country, illegal re-entry back into the country to reunite with their children and husband or wife. And I think that in many instances, the political conversation can and should move, and is moving towards understanding this as really a family issue, as opposed to some isolated issue over there about immigration that doesn't impact our communities.
Thank you both very much for coming.
Thank you.
And that's POTUS 2016 for today. We're here each week at this hour, keeping watch on the Oval Office and pouring cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.